And you can see the attendee list, the numbers going up on there as people join. Jordan, can you come over here and when we get pause, we just make it go live?
Mel, one last thing. Is it a hard stop at 10 or are you just going to play it by ear?
So what Joe did last time was at 11 o'clock, he said, if anyone wants to stick around and we can continue the discussion. So no, not a hard stop. But some people will have to leave.
Not a hard stop, but if you're going past 11,
all right, yeah. Okay, it's 10 o'clock, so we will get started. Looks like we've got 58 people here so far, so I think we're going to have a lot more people joining as we get going. But we might as well get started since we've got those of us here. Hi, I'm Melanie Johnson. I'm president of Adirondack Research Consortium and professor here at Paul Smith College. Thank you to everyone who's joined us for this and for previous webinars. Erica is going to put a link in chat with where you can get to the recordings of all 4 of the webinar series. This is our last webinar in the fall series, but we will be we're pretty sure we're doing another one in March because this has gone over really well. So keep your eyes open for that. I'd like to thank Adirondack Research Consortium and Paul Smith College have hosted the whole series. Resilience Studies Consortium has also been a co-host. And we had some sponsors, including Colgate University's Upstate Institute International Paper. And for just this forest carbon policies webinar, Adirondack Land Trust joined us. So during the webinar, Jeff Denkenberger is going to be the moderator and he'll introduce our speakers. But if you have any questions for the panelists, please put those in Q&A. And you can use chat we'll be sharing links there. And if you have just comments that you want to make, like good morning, everyone, feel free to put those in chat. Okay, I'm going to hand off to Jeff now.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks again for everybody for coming. Thanks, Mel, and for Paul Smith for hosting this. So we have 3 great panelists today. We have Tim McAbee from Finite Carbon, Christopher Jage, and Gabe Chapin from the Nature Conservancy. We're going to be talking, about carbon today, and as we all know, there's a lot going on with this and throughout the world. So this should be very good. As Mel said, put your questions in Q&A and we'll get started. I'm not going to hold us up. So first up is Tim McAbee from Finite Carbon.
All right. Hey, everyone. Let me get my screen shared here. This in presentation mode here. All right, can everybody see that? All right, sounds good. Well, thanks so much. I want to say thanks to Paul Smith College and Adirondack Research Consortium and our organizers, Melanie Johnson, and our panel moderator, Jeff Denkenberger. Jeff and I know each other from working together on several forest carbon projects between our 2 companies, and so he asked me to be on this panel. It's a pleasure to be here with the other panelists as well, Chris and Jage. I've been asked to give a brief overview of forest carbon offset markets, and that is the market that my company operates in. I'm going to try to do that in less time than I'm allotted to speak, so as to leave as much time for questions, because as soon as you start talking about forest carbon or carbon in general, all these questions just start to come into everybody's mind. So we'll try to leave enough time for questions. So again, it's a privilege to speak with you all today. I feel extra lucky being asked to be on the panel because I'm not a Paul Smith graduate. I actually graduated from the Ranger School and then went on to ESF down in Syracuse. but I had the great opportunity of being taught by several Paul Smith graduates, and I have family members that have graduated from Paul Smith and still play an active participation in various roles at the college. So glad to be here again. So I want to just start off quick and say that there is a huge amount of material on the internet about carbon markets and forest carbon offset projects. And so we're only going to be able to scratch the surface in the amount of time we have. But if you are interested in learning more, I would encourage you to go to the internet, talk to other experts, multiple experts. There's a lot of folks out there. But you can learn a great deal from just information online. I essentially self-taught myself forest carbon. I am a forester, but they weren't teaching forest carbon when I was in college, and so became interested in it and learned about it, and now operate in that space. Let's see. Forgive me on the way these slides come up, but. So again, I'm Tim McAbee. I'm Senior Vice President, Project Development at Finite Carbon. And Finite Carbon is a forest carbon offset project developer. And so what do? We help landowners generate revenue from the sale of forest carbon offset markets. What's unique about our company is that we are solely dedicated to forest carbon offset projects, and I'll speak. There are other types of carbon offset projects, but our company is uniquely positioned and focused solely on forest carbon offset projects. So just like I said, I'm going to give an high-level overview of the carbon offset markets, and I want to just touch on what I think is really important for the audience to understand. And so the first thing to understand about carbon markets is that they're divided into basically two markets, and the first one is a regulatory market, and the second is a voluntary market. So regulatory markets, also known as compliance markets, are created through policy and law. And because of that, on the demand side, you have natural buyers. So a good example of this is the California cap and trade that was implemented in 2012. And it is regulated through California's Air Resources Board agency. And what that law says is it requires entities to comply to a certain level of carbon emissions. So they put a cap on statewide emissions with covered entities, and then those covered entities have to comply with that cap. And they do that by receiving or purchasing permits, which are also known as allowances, from the state. And to a limited extent, that currently up to 8% of their emissions, they can purchase offset credits. So they have a primary method of complying, which is to purchase permits or allowances. But if they elect to, they can also purchase a certain amount of offset credits to help comply with their obligation there. Another good example, I think, that probably most of the audience is familiar with is the cap and trade market that was created on the NOx and SOx air pollutions that was causing acid rain. So especially if you're in Adirondacks, you're probably familiar with this, but that was a regulatory market where they decided that NOx and SOx gases were not good, and they put a cap on it. And then those manufacturing entities that were producing those emissions had to reduce their emissions. And if an entity reduced their emission beyond what they were required to, they essentially created credits that they could trade with other entities to meet their obligation. And so that's an example of a cap and trade market in a compliance market. The second carbon market is a voluntary market, and that's created through corporate responsibility sustainability initiatives and consumer demand, which are not required by law. So this is a little bit softer market, and it has been for the past 10 to 20 years, because there aren't natural buyers. The buyers are created on their own accord. A good example of this is most of you have probably seen some of the recent commercials by Amazon, where they're touting their goal to reach net zero carbon across direct and indirect operational activities by 2040. So there are a lot of other corporations and companies that are making these announcements, and we kind of go through waves of this, but in the past 12 to 18 months, we've really seen strong commitment, even despite the pandemic, for these corporations to put forth their plans, these kind of low carbon or net zero carbon initiatives. And really at a high level, what that entails is that they're going to measure their carbon footprint, and they're going to reduce that to some goal that they've set. And that initiative may or may not include the use of carbon offsets. And so the kind of the saying is measure and reduce and offset what you can't. And so Amazon is now an active buyer of carbon offset credits in the voluntary market. So just that's a little bit on the demand side. And the market supply side, it's in terms of offsets, they're going to come from offset projects. And specifically today, we're talking about forest offset credit projects. And those are uncapped, voluntarily implemented projects that reduce emissions or sequester carbon. And they have to be verified, registered, and approved by a carbon registry. So there are different types of offset project types, and the full extent of those types vary by market, whether it's a compliance or voluntary market. But I've listed here just some of the common types that exist in both markets. The NPR, if there are any NPR listeners out there, they just ran a piece a couple of weeks ago, a story about two business partners that were essentially offset developers for ozone depleting substances. So they travel around to different parts of the country and they pick up these old refrigerants and they aggregate them, and then they take them to a facility and they destroy those gases, and then they can register that and measure that to California. And the state of California will issue their company offset credits that they can then sell to these covered entities that are that have to comply with the cap and trade legislation. So that's one example of a non-forestry carbon offset project. But what we're speaking about today is mostly forestry projects, and within forestry there are several different types of projects. There's a voided conversion project. So you may have heard of projects that try to prevent the deforestation of rainforests in the Amazon. There's also an improved forest management project type, an afforestation project, so planting trees, and then urban forest projects. They all have different protocols or methodologies on how the offsets are quantified from a project, but those are some of the various different types. You may also heard what's becoming more popular today in the news is stories about agricultural soil projects. So maybe a farmer who switches to no-till practices, and they can measure the change in carbon sequestration that occurs from switching to that practice. But in general, forestry projects, they naturally capture carbon from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, and they store it in the wood. And then foresters can inventory the carbon, measure how it changes over time compared to a baseline that is representative of business as usual scenario. And now we're starting to get a little bit into the weeds and some of the debate on carbon offset projects. But if your project is successfully verified, approved, and registered, then the project's awarded credits. and they can then be sold by the landowner. So I'm not going to touch on this too much, but I just wanted to say that you could have the same land, the same property, and you would come up with a different number of offset credits, whether you tried to develop that project in a compliance market or a voluntary market, because each program is going to have its own methodology and interpretation of carbon accounting principles. And so this slide just kind of lists some of the different requirements by the methodology or the protocol. And I think probably one, if you're familiar with forest carbon offset projects at all, probably the one accounting principle you may have heard of is permanence. And so that's the idea that a ton of carbon sequestered is going to be equivalent to offset and emit one ton of carbon emissions. So in California, for their cap and trade program, they have interpreted permanence to say that if you're awarded a forestry offset credit, that you have to maintain the stocking on your forest for 100 plus years. In contrast, you may have a voluntary method, such as the American Carbon Registry has an improved forest management methodology, and they've interpreted permanence as 40 years. So it's a big difference, and definitely one of the considerations that a landowner would think about when choosing to develop a forest carbon offset project. I think one thing also to point out here is just that there is this myth that if you do a forest carbon offset project that you can't harvest anymore, and that's not true. There are really what the golden rule is, and you see that at the top for both methodologies, is that when you sell offset credits from your forest, you're now limited to maintaining those stocks at the level that you sold the offset credits. And so what that means in terms of harvest is that your harvest can exceed growth over the period of the project life. Just quickly, this is just a map of our Finite Carbon's ARB compliance forest portfolio. So it's a little outdated based off of some of the issuances that have occurred over the past few weeks. But we have close to 50 projects across 3 million acres. We've generated over 70 million offset credits for landowners with a value of over $750 million. So it's significant amount of revenue, and it's not for every single property, but for natural forests and hardwoods in particular, it can be a great fit. And this map just shows the diversity of types of landowners that we work with, from land trusts and nonprofit organizations to tribes, to TIMOs and REITs, and then family offices as well. What I've talked about up until this point, these offset projects are very expensive to develop, and they're generally standalone projects, so they have to be a certain size in order to cover the cost to develop. And so what that has done over the past 10 or 15 years is really excluded small family landowners, and Chris and Gabe are going to get into this too. But Finite Carbon also has begun an initiative to help give small family landowners access to carbon markets, and that's through our online digital platform called Core Carbon. And so a lot of great opportunities coming for small family landowners in carbon in general, but I would encourage you to check all the programs out. And this is essentially in our program for small family landowners, which will be available beginning of next year. A landowner will be able to go on to this platform, map out their project area, and through a remote sensed inventory, will be able to in real time give the landowner the type of payment that they would receive, and so it's really exciting opportunity. A lot of great opportunities coming for carbon. It's not something that is going away. We really believe over the next several decades that the carbon market in general is going to grow exponentially. I think that's all I've got. Back to you, Jeff.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Appreciate that. I believe I do have a question here. If I can get it to come up in chat. Yes, I have one question. Is there any suggestion that projects, regulatory or voluntary, will be restricted to localized geographies in the future? Balancing pollution, example, in LA must be balanced in California or out west?
So that is a good question, and it certainly is. So if you look at the California cap and trade program and their compliance offset market, they initially started out where it was just eligible, only properties within the lower 48 states were eligible. They have since then included parts of Alaska are now eligible, and then Hawaii is now that Hawaii has FIA plots that they may potentially come online too. But what you see is there are other cap and trade programs that exist. So there are several in some provinces in Canada. Believe it or not, there is a cap and trade program in several states in the Northeast called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. You don't really hear about it much for certain reasons, but you could, if you wanted to, develop a forest carbon offset project to their methodology, which is essentially the same as they essentially adopted California's methodology. But for market reasons, you don't really see anybody developing a project because it would just make sense to develop it to the California program because of the market there. But yeah, as you will see, there are definitely state initiatives, and we're closely following that. And so as states create policies and pass those, they may limit. Well, offsets may not be a part of their policy, but if they are, they could limit it to certain types of projects, and also limit it to in geographic scope to potentially just projects within the state. So definitely a good question.
Thanks, Tim. I'm going to give you one more question and then we're going to move on. Can you share a little bit more about the methodology you will use for the core carbon program?
So there will be several methodologies that are going to be part of that program, but the first one that is going to be available in 2021 is going to be a deferred harvest methodology. So essentially, the landowner is going to be paid for carbon for not harvesting for a certain period of time, and then as the program progresses, the improved forest management methodologies will come online. And so it's the deferred harvest methodology is just an easy one to start with and get out there and have folks be introduced to. And so it will be a commitment that the landowner makes to defer harvest for a certain period of time, get paid for the carbon that they sequester over that time period. But as I said, then more methodologies will be included in that program where landowners can participate and still have the flexibility to harvest.
Great, thanks, Tim. We've got a lot of questions coming in, and so we're going to move on, and then at the end we'll have more time to ask more questions. So I believe Gabe is up. So it's all you, Gabe. Thanks a lot, Tim. That was very good.
Great. Thanks a lot, Jeff. And thanks, Tim, for your presentation. That was a great overview. So my name's Gabe Chapin. I'm the Forest Carbon Program Manager for the Nature Conservancy in New York. And I just want to spend a little time talking today about the Nature Conservancy and sort of what our role is and what we do in relation to forest carbon markets. So as a not-for-profit conservation organization, obviously, one of the things we're very concerned with is addressing climate change. We see it as one of the biggest threats to both people and nature. And in particular, we're focused on ways that we can use nature and natural systems to help mitigate the potential impacts of climate change. So that's in New York and across North America, really, we've got a lot of forest. It's sucking up a lot of carbon and has a lot of potential to really help address the climate change threat. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. And so just to first kind of take a little bit of a step back, I want to just talk a little bit about carbon storage and carbon sequestration in forests. And these are some great graphics. This comes from a publication that was put out by UMass Amherst and UMass Extension. And the left-hand side here shows different forest types. And it shows kind of how much and where these different, or where carbon is being stored in these different forest types. And you can see it varies quite a bit. So the number in the center just represents the total number of tons of carbon that are stored in that forest type on average. And just a quick note, these are metric tons of carbon. You may see numbers oftentimes represented in metric tons of CO2 equivalent. So those are two different numbers, but it's very easy to kind of convert from one to another. And so most of the time when we think about forest carbon, you sort of visualize what that looks like and you think about a bunch of standing trees, right? And that's one of the pools of carbon that exist in a forest, and that's represented by this dark green. But you also have carbon being stored in the root systems, which are this kind of medium blue color. There's carbon being stored in the dead and down wood, but also in some of the standing dead trees. And then even the litter layer stores, a certain amount of carbon in the forest. And then also another huge pool is actually the soil. So as woody debris is kind of decomposing, a lot of that soil or a lot of that carbon is ending up in the soil. So you can see actually what you see when you walk through the woods is actually only a fraction, generally speaking, of the total amount of carbon that forest is storing. And you can see in some of the drier forest types like oak pine and oak hickory, there's a much greater percentage of carbon being stored in the standing trees versus, say, the soil. But in a system like spruce fir, actually relatively small proportion of the carbon is actually in the trees. The majority of it is in the soil. And from a carbon market standpoint and the carbon offset projects, what you're really focused on is this above ground carbon and the carbon that's in the root systems of the trees, not so much the soil carbon or the other pools. This graphic on the right here, this circular graphic shows, I think this is really kind of a neat graphic. As you go around the circle, kind of clockwise, you increase in stand age. And so it goes kind of from 0 to 400 years. And this outer ring, the brown ring, is showing how much carbon is being stored in that forest at a varying stand ages. And you can see as the forest gets older and older and older and older, it's storing more and more and more carbon. By contrast, you can see the green ring just inside there is actually showing the rate at which that forest is sequestering additional carbon. So this is the rate that it's taking in new carbon out of the atmosphere and converting it into wood. And you can see that actually peaks somewhere between sort of a pole timber and a small saw timber stage, and actually stays fairly high. I've seen other research that suggests it stays very high actually through 100 to 120 years into the stand development. But generally it's peaking somewhere between pole timber, small saw timber, and it does continue, the forest does continue to accrue carbon and sequester carbon throughout, until it's very old. But the rate at which it's sequestering new carbon tends to slow down. So just to talk about a little bit about how this translates into climate mitigation. And so this graph is showing on the left-hand column here a variety of different strategies and ways that you can use nature increase carbon sequestration. So the bars on the right-hand side, the length of the bars just showing sort of the magnitude of that carbon sequestration potential, and the dark portion of the bar is sort of the cheap carbon, and then the light gray portion of the bar is kind of the more expensive carbon. And you can see that compared to strategies that revolve around agriculture and grasslands and wetlands, forests have a great potential to actually take in carbon out of the atmosphere and help us kind of mitigate the impacts of climate change. And in particular, managing our natural forests, which is really what these forest carbon programs are all about, has great potential to do that. And not only great potential, but it has a relatively high proportion of relatively affordable additional carbon that can be sequestered. So that's really the focus of our program. And we call it the Working Woodlands program. This is really a partnership between the Nature Conservancy and landowners, where we're working with the landowner to actively manage their property in a way that increases the forest, the carbon sequestration on the property. We're then able to work with a carbon development like Finite or others to actually monetize that into carbon offset credits, and create a new revenue stream for that landowner. And then a component of our program, which isn't necessarily a requirement of the carbon program, but provides a lot of value. And Chris is going to talk a little bit more about this, but it's sort of this forest protection element. So ensuring that we're sequestering carbon in the forest, and we want it to stay as forest so we don't lose that storage over time. So how does it work? So Tim provided a great overview of kind of the market side, and this is maybe a little bit more from the landowner and project perspective, how this kind of works and how a carbon project is developed. So the first step is usually to do some kind of feasibility assessment, go out, actually collect some initial data, try and do some financial projections on the project. And as Tim mentioned, there are some long-term expenses. It's fairly expensive to develop these projects. You have to make sure that there's enough value to kind of cover those costs. There's the whole sort of project initiation and development phase. So this involves going out and actually inventorying all the carbon that's on the property, doing a bunch of growth modeling and credit yield modeling for the project up front, and then it has to go to a third-party verifier. So this is a completely separate organization. It's essentially doing a full audit on the entire carbon project before the credits can be issued by the registry. We also will work, hand in hand with the landowner to develop a forest management plan if they don't have one, or update an existing forest management plan and provide some kind of forest certification, which Tim mentioned is part of the requirements of a carbon project. So if you're doing active timber harvesting, you have to be third-party certified, whether it's through Forest Stewardship Council, SFI, or Tree Farm. The Nature Conservancy, for our projects, we handle all the marketing and sales of the credits. So we work directly in the voluntary market. The Nature Conservancy does have California compliance projects that we've done in the past, but typically when we're working with private landowners, the voluntary market, and particularly the American Carbon Registry, is kind of the easiest program for landowners to engage in. So we actually work directly with corporations to sell the credits on behalf of the landowner. And then the overall carbon project term itself is 40 years, where, as Tim mentioned, the landowner needs to just ensure that they're not over harvesting their timber, just make sure that the carbon that's been sold, they can continue to actively manage it, but whatever they've sold, they can't then go harvest that carbon. They are effectively reversing the carbon benefit that we got. So there also are some landowner protections that are kind of built into the carbon market. So, if there's a pest outbreak on the property or some extensive storm damage and credits are lost, there are mechanisms that are built in to kind of replace those credits when they get lost. So this is just a little more detail in the carbon development process, and I'm not going to go into it in any detail because I think we've sort of covered it. But I think the big takeaway here is just it is fairly complex to develop these projects. So, usually from our first conversation with a landowner to actually generating revenue at the sort of the back end of that project development can be, anywhere from 24 to 36 months. Just takes time to develop the project, to do the inventories and the modeling, and then we actually have to, allow time for the trees to grow, and then verify everything, and then actually take it to the market and be able to sell it. And there are, throughout the 40-year duration of a carbon project, there are sort of long-term stewardship needs in terms of, ensuring that we're continuing to re-inventory and re-verify the project over time. The revenues, from a landowner's perspective, it's very highly variable and specific to a project, and it depends on how big the project is, what the initial carbon stocking is at the beginning of the project, and whether or not there are any constraints, whether it's legal constraints or practical constraints on how that property could be managed, and what the business as usual scenario could be, as Tim described. That affects how many credits you're able to generate from a project. But generally, with American Carbon Registry projects, it's kind of front loaded. You get the majority of the revenue in the first 10 years, but you can continue to generate revenue from the project over time after that. And what kinds of properties are kind of eligible for a program like this? So generally, just because of the cost involved, 2,000 acres we've found is kind of the bare minimum, and really that would have to be even a pretty well-stocked property to sort of generate enough value to cover all the long-term expenses. We've worked with municipal landowners, water authorities, where county forest lands could be eligible, or other municipal lands, as long as there's no restrictions on the timber harvesting that could occur on those properties. Obviously, private lands, they have to be large holdings and obviously not have restrictions on timber harvesting. And there are some emerging programs. Tim talked about Finite's Core Carbon program. The Nature Conservancy is also working with the American Tree Farm system, or to develop carbon family forest carbon program, which really allows smaller landowners to engage in carbon programs. And of course, also another initiative that we're working on is carbon co-ops, which are actually getting groups of landowners together and actually creating an aggregated project and taking that to market to sort of meet some of these minimum project size requirements and just to make the project feasible. Just some additional information. So this UMass extension publication that I referenced at the beginning, I think it's just a great publication if you're looking for more information just generally about forest carbon, how carbon is stored and sequestered in forests. And then there's just some other resources, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, which is a program in the Forest Service, the Nature Conservancy. You can find more information on our Working Woodlands website. And also, just if you're interested, I did see some questions that had been submitted earlier just about kind of carbon and what it means and how much carbon is being stored. The EPA website has a great little converter. So you can say, look at an acre of forest, how much, gas that might replace in terms of the carbon sequestration. So just a fun site to go in if you feel like poking around and finding some additional information. And that's all I have.
All right, thanks a lot, Gabe. That was very informative, and I think we're just going to move right on. Keep sending in your questions, and panelists can answer them as they're not talking. But Chris, the stage is yours.
All right, thank you very much. So this piece is going to be, rather a quick little coda to Gabe's presentation. But my name is Chris Jage, and I'm the land protection manager for the Nature Conservancy in New York. And as Gabe alluded to on this slide previously, there's sort of three components to our Working Woodlands program. Forest carbon, which is obviously the topic of today, we're going into deeply, but these other two, which is in way an aside from what we're talking about today, but is also kind of the main point. It's about making sure that we have good, healthy, productive forests for all the reasons that we want them moving forward. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about the forest management and protection work that we do. When we enter these projects, there are times when landowners don't have a forest management plan, they don't have a professional forester they're working with. And so for them to have a sustainable yield of that forest, or for whatever the reason that they want to have that forest providing benefits to them, just working with them and getting that management plan, whether it's getting them an external forester or us, working together, is to get that plan is critical. And as I say, you sort of get what you plan for. If you don't have a plan, the likelihood that you're going to be able to maintain a healthy forest is diminished. So getting that plan in place alone is a benefit to that forest itself. But as these programs require, getting certification is that next level. So the Nature Conservancy has a group certificate for enrollment in FSC, but other programs are available as well. It gets that third-party verification for the forest management practices, but it's also a global sort of comprehensive look at the forestry operation. It looks at its context in the community. It looks at social issues, at other things that really say, is this a good operation for this land and this community? So you sort of get that certification that it is meeting the global standards for that given program. But as the Nature Conservancy, we look at more than just forests as a vacuum cleaner for carbon or as a purveyor of 2x4s. It is the entire system. So it's all the values that a forest is and has, both for the landscape and the ecosystem, but for us as well. So when we approach these projects, we also look at working with these landowners. How do we assess what we have here and what's worthy of protecting? And so in our world in conservation, we look at things we call conservation values. So what are the inherent characteristics of these properties that make them valuable for the landscape, for the ecosystem, for the wildlife, for us? And carbon sequestration, the whole point of the carbon markets, is certainly one of those. And we try to protect that through these mechanisms. But it's everything else. It's the water quality, it's the wildlife, it's the recreational values, all those sorts of things. So by looking at that comprehensively, we sort of build these appreciations and protections into these projects in the management plans, but also in the conservation outcomes. And so that's the one thing that we're really hoping for at the end, is that we strive for these durable conservation agreements. As Tim mentioned before, one of the clues I think you can find that the carbon markets came out of financial markets and not out of conservation is that they've defined permanence with an end date, 40 years, 60 years, 100 years. In the conservation world, we're very comfortable with the concept of perpetuity. That's our stock in trade, is protecting lands for perpetuity. So knowing that a carbon agreement alone is a contract, it's between people and it has an end. The conservation easements or other conservation mechanisms that we can use, they're actually interests in land and they're perpetual. So we put these together to say that we're going to get the good benefits that we can for carbon sequestration, and the landowners can get paid for the carbon that they are sequestering for all of us. And then the conservation easement protects that and everything else that we valued on the property moving forward. And that for us really is that's what makes this whole Working Woodlands program so valuable, is it's getting all of that conservation, including the carbon sequestration, together in one package. But going back to the carbon project itself, it's important to note that by adding this piece, this conservation piece, which is an optional piece in the markets per se, it adds to that carbon project. It actually provides more value. It actually provides more credits to the landowner to sell. And on the other side, what I'm going to call the consumer confidence side, those companies and even individuals, when we check a box to, when we're flying on a plane and you say, do you want to offset your carbon footprint? You're buying some of these credits. And so the consumer confidence, knowing that you're actually, investing in projects that have durable conservation outcomes, and you can feel better about you're actually doing something well. So I'm going to end it there. We got about 15, 20 minutes left. I think there's a lot of questions coming in. And so I will turn it back to Jeff. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks a lot, Chris. Thanks to all three of you. That was a great overview. There's a lot going on with all of this. And, as a landowner, as working myself for a large private landowner, there's so many options to try to generate revenue and, conserve your land. So landowners are always juggling that, and these are the guys that we go to figure out what we're going to do. So anyway, we do have some questions here. I'm going to start with this one, and it's Gabe. It's going to go to you, and it's going to go referencing your one slide that you had the good graphics on there. It's just a question about the difference between the light and gray and dark gray bars, cheap and expensive carbon. Can you explain that again? So if you could get that slide back up, we can get this answered for Katie.
All right, I'm going to try to back through this. Here we go. So this graph, I believe.
I believe so.
Yeah, so this is the one that talks about kind of the cheap versus expensive carbon. And really, all that means is that if you want to go out and reforest, land, say that, have had all the trees cut, or that it's old agricultural land, there are sort of cheap ways to do that, right? You can rely on, say, natural regeneration to reforest that piece of property for you. It doesn't really cost a lot of money to do it. Unless you live in the Hudson Valley like I do and you have to put up deer fencing around it. But if you want to go out and actually, there's only so many opportunities potentially to do that. And what this is showing is that, to get a real extensive benefit from doing that, you might have to pursue other strategies. Like that option may only be available to you on a certain amount of land, and there's only a certain amount of potential to sequester additional carbon through that cheap way of doing things. The light gray portion represents, maybe these are areas where you actually have to go out and plant trees, right? And so then for every ton of carbon, you got to pay for the trees, you got to pay to put them in the ground, you've got to protect them somehow. And then there may be other strategies, like if you're trying to avoid conversion to, or you're trying to take, an active farm or ranch somewhere and try to convert it into forest land, you'd have to buy that property and change the use. And so those are expensive ways of doing it. And when we look at natural forest management here, it's just the opportunities to do things fairly cost effectively versus less cost effectively, or just that ratio is a little bit better.
Thanks, Gabe. Next question, it could be either Chris or Gabe. How does TNC pay for their upfront short-term and long-term expenses? If you can answer that.
Sure, I can answer that. So TNC, for our projects, we do take, it's sort of like a revenue sharing arrangement with the landowner. So we actually use a portion of the carbon revenue and set that aside, and then use that to cover the long-term expenses if there's not revenue coming in to cover those costs in the long term. And the upfront costs, again, we take on that upfront financial risk for the landowner, but generally the upfront expenses are paid by the sum of the revenue that is generated by the carbon project.
Great, thanks. Does the income stream continue after the 10 years? And if so, at what level? That could go to anybody, I think.
I can take a little bit of a stab at that one also, and then maybe Tim also has a perspective on this because probably has more experience kind of developing projects certainly than I do. But the protocols that we use with the American Carbon Registry, they do sort of front load the project. You can continue to sell credits in years, say 10 through 40, but just based on the protocols, it's much lower. And I don't have a good answer for exactly what that difference is, but it's yes, significantly less over time. And without looking at a specific project, it's really hard to say exactly what that revenue looks like. And again, Tim may be able to speak to that a lot more intelligently than I.
Yeah, so as long as you have a program and a willing buyer, you can continue to sell credits. So like for example, the California Compliance Offset Program, their program was slated to expire this year, but they passed legislation about a year and a half ago that extended the offset program to 2030. So right now, people could develop projects or projects that already exist or could at least generate credits until 2030, and as long as buyers are still buying them, they could sell them. So it is definitely that is one risk of a carbon offset project, is that with the California program, if you have to, just because you can't sell the credits, you're still could potentially be on the hook to monitor, report, and verify your stocks for 100 years. Same with the voluntary program. For example, ACR is 40 years. Generally, all the programs have a crediting period that is shorter than the permanence period or the project life. So with ARB, California ARB, they have 25-year crediting periods that you can renew. And as long as the program still exists and you still have buyers, you can generate credits and sell them. With ACR, under their 40-year improved forest management program, they have a 20-year crediting period. And so you can generate credits for 20 years. And if you want to generate them for after that, you would have to renew your crediting period, which might entail looking at resetting your baseline essentially. And look, because if in 20 years there is a law that says forest landowners have to sequester carbon to a certain level, then that's generally a that would become a regulated sector, and you're not sequestering carbon by choice. You're not doing it voluntarily anymore. You're doing it by law, and so there is no additionality associated with generating those credits. So definitely, as you consider implementing carbon projects, you want to consider what that cash flow could potentially look like.
Thanks, guys. A question for either Chris or Gabe: do your eligible lands include no-till ag lands?
Chris, did you want to take that?
Well, yeah. So for TNC in New York, no. Right now, we're only working with doing forest projects. Our Midwestern colleagues in the organization are looking at this. It's a new and emerging market, but right now in the state of New York, we're doing projects that improve this, but improve soil health and carbon sequestration, but not monetizing it as of yet.
Thanks, Chris. Just to answer a quick question, these presentations will be available. You'll be able to watch the video afterwards online. Erica will get us out that information. All right, this is a question for any one of you. Given the projected population increase of 2 billion more people by 2050 and the increased agricultural needs, will it be possible to achieve carbon sequestration goals with a sufficient amount of forest cover? Who wants it?
Well, I'll bite. I'll start. I think it's important to remember that these techniques are extremely important in the fight against climate change, but emissions reductions are the key. If we're talking about carbon, If we don't, this won't, these strategies alone do not address the fact that emissions need to be reduced drastically, particularly in the transportation sector. So yeah, it's, the potential for, as Gabe was just showing in that graph, the potential for this is tremendous, but it has to be, seen in conjunction with other methods for mitigation, and quite frankly, like you're saying, the other needs and how we, do agriculture and that sort of thing moving forward, so that it is in the most carbon sensitive way. But that's a, that's a big question.
I agree. Tim, did you want to add anything to that? I think you were on mute when you said something at the beginning, or?
No, I was just making a funny comment that I wish I knew the answer to that question. I'd be rich.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks. Quick one. Any sense of how many forest acres are in carbon agreements in the Adirondacks currently?
What was the question again?
How many acres are like an estimate of the acreage enrolled in programs in the Adirondacks currently?
It's in the hundreds of thousands of acres, just within ARB and just finite carbon projects. Molpus has several, so.
Yeah, I would agree. There's quite a few thousand acres up here. What effect do land use restrictions within the Adirondack Park have on these programs, if any? Great question. Who wants that?
At it. So they definitely do. So whether it's a ARB project or a voluntary project, for an improved forest management project, you're comparing your project stocks to a baseline scenario. And that's how credits are generated, the delta in between your project stocks and the baseline scenario. And that baseline scenario is essentially a hypothetical model that demonstrates what the landowner could do if they wanted to. So I think an extreme case of this is to say, if there was a property and you had sold a conservation easement or donated a conservation easement 10 years ago, where you sold your rights to harvest the timber, you would essentially not be able to demonstrate that you could harvest the timber in a baseline scenario. And so you would not be able to produce any additional credits. But in the case of the Adirondacks, with the restrictions on silviculture, you can still practice silviculture for sure, but in your baseline scenario, you're going to have to demonstrate to a verifier and the registry that the harvest and growth regime in that baseline scenario is legally permissible and financially feasible. So it's not just a default lookup baseline level of stocks. It is, you have to demonstrate what you could legally and financially do if you wanted to. But instead of implementing that baseline scenario, you are implementing a project scenario that maintains or increased carbon stocks. And so the difference between those stocking levels is what we refer to as additionality. And that's what programs issue credits for, is those additional credits.
Right. Thanks, Tim. Next question, and it could go to any one of you guys. How do you address the criticism that these programs don't mitigate climate change or force polluters to pollute less?
So I can take a little bit of a stab at this. I think from the Nature Conservancy's perspective, I mean, the criticism that it doesn't mitigate climate change, I mean, they're just based on the registry standards. They're peer reviewed, they go through third-party verifications. And so, there's a robust process around assessing the additionality that Tim was mentioning. And it really takes into consideration a whole range of different potential restrictions on a piece of property, and what a landowner could or couldn't do. So, we feel very confident that these programs do and are in fact a necessary component of addressing climate change. from the standpoint of forcing polluters to pollute less, I mean, I know I can't speak entirely across, the carbon market sectors, just in terms of what I have experience with and what the Nature Conservancy does. We work in the voluntary market, and we are selective about who we work with and who we sell credits to. And one of the major components for us to engage with a corporation, say, that wants to offset, is that they are actively taking steps to increase the use of renewables and address energy efficiency types of issues before they're turning to offset. So it's not just they're buying offsets so they can do business as usual. They're trying to be sustainable as a corporation. And oftentimes offsets are a piece of that, because there are certain things, especially now, we don't have solar powered airplanes yet, so we're still using jet fuel. And that's when we're not in a global pandemic, that's a huge source of emissions for a lot of companies if they have to do a lot of travel. So that's probably one of the most common things we'll do, is offset things like air travel or other types of emissions that are just really difficult to address otherwise.
Thanks, Gabe. All right, well, listen, great questions, great presentations. Is there anything else from our three panelists that you guys would like to end with, or any other comments? If not, listen, I appreciate it. I want to thank Mel here, who's put all these seminars together, and this is her fourth and final one. She's done a great job. She's been really good for us here at ARC. So thank her, and Paul Smith, Chris, Gabe, and Tim. Thanks so much for taking the time to do this. And I think we need to maybe do some follow-up on presentations like this in the spring. So stay tuned for that, everybody. I thank everybody for coming on. And even though we can't see you all, we had just over 100 participants, I believe. And we really appreciate you tuning in today. Any other questions that you have, you can go to our website and catch everything there, or find our contact information and get a hold of us directly. So thanks so much. Hope everybody has a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.